Sergeant James Carter sat quietly at the airport terminal, his weathered duffel bag resting by his feet. The fabric was stained with the marks of foreign deserts and humid jungles, a silent testament to the years he had spent serving his country. The world bustled around him, families laughing, businesspeople hurriedly tapping on laptops, and children dragging oversized teddy bears, but James felt oddly detached. It was always like this when he came home, a strange sense of otherness despite fighting for the freedom of the very people rushing by. James clutched a photograph in his hand. It was creased from the countless times he had unfolded it during long nights at the base. His wife and daughter smiled back at him, their faces radiant with love. He missed them fiercely. Their smiles were his anchor, the thing that kept him going when bombs fell and comrades cried out for their mothers in their last breaths. Almost there, he murmured to himself, tucking the photo into his jacket pocket as his flight was called for boarding. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope and relief warmed his chest. He could almost hear his daughter's laughter as he imagined the moment he would step through the front door. James settled into his seat, carefully stowing his bag under the chair. He adjusted the lapel of his faded military jacket, feeling a sense of pride even as the fabric bore the scars of wear. It didn't matter to him. It was a part of who he was, a symbol of his duty and resilience. The aisle grew crowded as more passengers boarded. Among them was Evelyn Stanton, her heels clicking sharply against the airplane floor as she approached her seat. She carried an aura of self-importance, her designer coat and oversized sunglasses screaming of wealth and entitlement. She was followed by a flight attendant carrying her Louis Vuitton handbag, an unnecessary display of her status. When Evelyn reached her assigned seat, she froze. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face as she realized she would be seated next to James. Slowly, she removed her sunglasses, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. "You must be kidding me," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for James to hear. Evelyn turned to the flight attendant trailing behind her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is there some sort of mistake? I specifically requested a comfortable seat for this flight. First class was fully booked, so I settled for this row. But I certainly didn't agree to sit next to this." James stiffened but said nothing. He had heard these tones before, the veiled disgust. Yet, after everything he'd endured, it still felt like a punch to the gut. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tightening as he tried to focus on the sound of the flight attendants greeting other passengers. The young flight attendant's face turned red. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is your assigned seat." "Well, fix it," Evelyn snapped, her voice rising. "I am not spending the next 3 hours crammed next to." She glanced at James again, her lips curling in disdain. Someone like him. A few passengers turned their heads. Murmurs began to ripple through the cabin. James closed his eyes briefly, willing himself to stay calm. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant stammered, "but there are no other seats available." "Unacceptable," Evelyn hissed. "I paid good money for this ticket. Surely you can find someone willing to swap with me." James finally turned to her. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of years spent commanding respect. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to get home to my family. Let's get through this flight in peace." Evelyn recoiled as if his words were a personal affront. "Don't talk to me," she snapped. "I didn't ask for your opinion." James's chest tightened, but he refused to engage further. He had survived bullets, explosions, and sleepless nights. He wouldn't let the venom of one entitled woman break his composure. But deep down, it stung. Here he was, a man who had risked everything for his country, only to be treated as if he didn't belong as the plane prepared for takeoff. Evelyn grew increasingly agitated. She muttered loudly to herself about standards and dealing with people who don't know their place. Her voice intentionally loud enough to ensure James could hear. Each word was a knife, slicing at the dignity he had fought so hard to preserve. But the tipping point came when she turned to him abruptly. "Do you even belong on this flight? Or did you win your ticket in some sort of charity raffle?" Gasps echoed from nearby passengers. James stared at her, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but something inside him told him not to stoop to her level. When he didn't reply, Evelyn's face contorted with frustration. She reached out suddenly, grabbing the lapel of his jacket. "I'm talking to you, soldier boy. Do you even understand English?" The cabin erupted in chaos. Passengers stood up, shouting for her to stop. A flight attendant rushed over, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, let go of him," the attendant demanded. Evelyn released James but not before shoving him lightly, her manicured nails leaving faint scratches on his jacket. "Unbelievable," she shrieked. "This is unacceptable." James didn't move. He sat silently, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. But his eyes, filled with a mixture of pain and quiet resolve, spoke volumes. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, someone had been watching the entire scene unfold from a few rows back. Elizabeth Harrington, the mayor of a nearby city, sat with her arms crossed, her sharp blue eyes fixated on Evelyn. She wore a tailored navy suit that gave her an air of authority. But it was her unflinching stare that commanded true power. Elizabeth had seen her share of injustice during her career. But this was something different. Watching Evelyn berate and assault a man who had clearly done nothing wrong ignited a fire in her chest. She made a mental note of every insult, every act of aggression. This wasn't going to end here. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Elizabeth leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. Justice, she thought, would find Evelyn Stanton, and it would be swift and undeniable. The plane had settled into a tense silence after Evelyn's outburst. Passengers whispered among themselves, their voices a mix of disbelief and disapproval. James could feel their eyes on him, some filled with sympathy, others with pity. He hated both. He stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by. But his mind was elsewhere. Memories surfaced unbidden, his squad laughing around a campfire, the smell of gunpowder in the air, the cries of a fallen friend calling out his name. He had endured so much, sacrificed so much, only to return to this, a country that still judged him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. A child's voice broke through his thoughts. "Mommy, why is that lady yelling at the man?" It was innocent, curious, and loud enough to draw attention. The mother hushed the child quickly. But the damage was done. Evelyn stiffened in her seat, clearly aware that she had become the center of negative attention. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but her glare remained fixed on James, as if blaming him for the scrutiny. James inhaled deeply, his hands gripping his knees. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to speak up, to defend himself. But what could he say? He knew from experience that people like Evelyn didn't listen to reason. To her, his silence was weakness. But James knew better. His silence was strength, a refusal to be dragged into the mud. Evelyn leaned toward the flight attendant, her voice low but venomous. "I hope you realize the liability you're creating here," she hissed. "I'm not being difficult, I'm protecting myself. I don't know where he's been or what kind of lifestyle he leads." The flight attendant's expression tightened, her professionalism barely masking her disgust. "Ma'am, Sergeant Carter is a veteran. He's served our country. Please show some respect." "Respect?" Evelyn's laugh was cold and sharp. "Respect is earned. And let's just say I don't see anything worthy of it sitting in that seat." The attendant turned to James, her voice softening. "Sir, I'm so sorry about all this. Is there anything I can do for you?" James shook his head, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you." But he wasn't fine. His heart pounded, his breath shallow. He thought of his daughter, how she looked up to him, believed in him. Would she understand if he stayed silent? Or would she think he'd let someone take away his dignity? The tension in the cabin spread like wildfire. Passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, and whispers grew louder. A young woman sitting across the aisle leaned over and whispered to her husband. "She's out of line. Someone should say something." An older man, a veteran himself, nodded grimly. He shouldn't have to deal with this. Not after everything he's been through. But no one spoke up. The collective silence hung in the air like a storm cloud. Oppressive and heavy. James felt it, the weight of their inaction. And it stung almost as much as Evelyn's words. He had fought for these people, for their right to live freely and safely. And now they sat, paralyzed by discomfort and fear of confrontation. He closed his eyes, his mind flashing back to a moment in the desert, a firefight. Chaos all around. His squad had been pinned down, the enemy closing in. It was then he'd learned the true meaning of courage, doing the right thing, even when fear threatened to consume you. In the row behind Evelyn, a boy no older than 10 leaned into the aisle, his big brown eyes fixed on James. "Mister," he whispered, his voice hesitant but sincere. Are you a real soldier? James turned, surprised. The boy's mother tried to pull him back, but James managed a small smile. I am, he said gently. Did you fight bad guys? The boy asked. His voice filled with awe. James hesitated, unsure how to answer. I did my best to keep people safe. The boy grinned. That's cool. Evelyn rolled her eyes, muttering something about hero worship. But James didn't care. For the first time since boarding, he felt a flicker of warmth. That brief exchange reminded him of why he'd chosen to serve, why he endured the pain and the sacrifice. The moment of connection was short-lived. Evelyn, emboldened by the lack of intervention from the crew or passengers, turned her full attention back to James. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? She sneered. Let me tell you something, soldier boy. Just because you wear that uniform doesn't make you better than anyone else. If anything, it makes you worse. You people use that uniform to cover up your incompetence. James's stomach churned, but he said nothing. He refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Evelyn leaned closer, her voice dropping to a poisonous whisper. You think people don't see you for what you really are? You're nothing, and you'll never be anything. At that moment, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. Passengers gasped as the aircraft shook, the seatbelt sign flickering on. Evelyn clutched the armrests, her bravado faltering briefly. James, however, remained still, his expression calm despite the storm raging around him, both inside the cabin and within himself from her seat in the back row. Mayor Elizabeth Harrington observed the scene with growing anger. Her hand gripped the leather-bound notebook resting in her lap, her knuckles white. She had remained silent up to this point, watching, assessing, but Evelyn's last words had crossed a line. Elizabeth wasn't just a politician, she was a fighter. Her entire career had been built on confronting injustice head-on, and this was no exception. She straightened in her seat, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she prepared to act. But first, she wanted Evelyn to dig her own grave. The more the woman revealed about her true character, the stronger Elizabeth's case would be when the time came to hold her accountable. She signaled to the flight attendant, who leaned down to listen. Is there a problem here? Ma'am? The attendant asked. Elizabeth's voice was calm but firm. Yes, and I intend to address it. The plane steadied after the brief turbulence. But the tension in the cabin was far from settled. Evelyn adjusted her coat with exaggerated movements, clearly trying to reclaim her sense of control. Her gaze flitted around the cabin, catching the disapproving stares of the other passengers. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. Unbelievable, she muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. This is why standards are important. They let just anyone on planes these days. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A middle-aged woman in the row across whispered, "She's making a fool of herself." Her companion nodded, but neither said anything aloud. James, however, could feel the pressure mounting. Each word Evelyn spewed was like a needle pricking at his composure. He had been taught to keep calm under fire, to never let emotions dictate his actions. But this wasn't a battlefield. There were no enemies to fight, no orders to follow. This was raw, unprovoked hatred, and it stung deeper than any wound he had ever endured. He looked out of the window, the endless expanse of clouds offering little comfort. Inside, he wrestled with the urge to defend himself, to tell this woman everything he had sacrificed for people like her. But what would it change? People like Evelyn didn't listen. They didn't care. Suddenly, Evelyn slammed her hands on the armrest, startling the passengers around her. I can't sit here another second, she snapped, standing up abruptly despite the seatbelt sign being on. The flight attendant hurried over, her face tight with frustration. Ma'am, please sit down. The seatbelt sign is still on. Evelyn ignored her, pointing at James. I demand to be moved. This man is making me uncomfortable. Who knows what he's capable of? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Gasps rippled through the cabin. James's head turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Evelyn's. For the first time, he spoke, his voice low and steady. Ma'am, he said, I've spent my entire life protecting this country, protecting people like you. I don't need to prove anything to you. Evelyn scoffed, crossing her arms. Protecting people? Spare me the hero act. You're just another thug hiding behind a uniform. The words hit James like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He felt the weight of every insult, every assumption, every piece of hatred that Evelyn had directed at him. The cabin was silent now. Every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. The silence was broken by a voice. Calm but commanding. "That's enough." All heads turned to the back of the cabin. Mayor Elizabeth Harrington stood, her presence immediately filling the space. Her tailored navy suit gave her an air of authority. But it was the look in her eyes, sharp and unyielding, that silenced Evelyn mid-sentence. Elizabeth stepped into the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. She moved with purpose, her gaze fixed on Evelyn. "Ma'am," she said, her voice even, "you're making a spectacle of yourself. And it's unacceptable." Evelyn blinked, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are?" Elizabeth smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm someone who doesn't tolerate bigotry. Especially not against the men and women who've served this country." Gasps of recognition rippled through the cabin as passengers began to realize who she was. Elizabeth Harrington wasn't just any passenger. She was the mayor of one of the largest cities in the region. A leader known for her fierce advocacy for justice and equality. Evelyn's bravado faltered. But she quickly recovered, her tone defensive. "This has nothing to do with bigotry. I have the right to feel safe. And I don't feel safe sitting next to him." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Safe from what, exactly? A soldier returning home to his family? Or is it the color of his skin that makes you uncomfortable?" Evelyn's face flushed. "How dare you imply that I'm racist? I was simply pointing out that this man's presence is unsettling." "Unsettling," Elizabeth repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "I find it unsettling that someone like you can spew hatred so freely. You're not just embarrassing yourself, you're embarrassing everyone on this plane." The passengers erupted into murmurs of agreement. Some even clapped quietly, their courage bolstered by Elizabeth's intervention. Evelyn's confidence began to crack. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an ally, but she found none. The passengers who had remained silent before now stared at her with open disapproval. Even the flight attendant seemed to stand a little straighter, her demeanor more resolute. "You can't talk to me like this," Evelyn snapped, her voice shaking. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Elizabeth's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You're a bully who thinks her money and privilege give her the right to trample over others. But let me tell you something, not here. Not today." James watched the exchange with a mixture of relief and awe. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. He didn't need to fight this battle alone. Someone else had stepped into the fray. Someone who refused to let hatred go unchallenged. As Elizabeth continued to dismantle Evelyn's arguments, other passengers began to find their voices. "She's right," said the young woman across the aisle. "You've been awful this entire flight." "Yeah," added the older veteran. "You owe that man an apology." Evelyn turned to glare at the growing chorus of voices. "Oh, so now everyone's ganging up on me? This is harassment." "No, ma'am," Elizabeth replied coolly. "This is accountability." The flight attendant stepped forward, her voice firm. "Ma'am, if you don't sit down and stop disrupting the flight, we'll be forced to report you to the authorities upon landing." Evelyn's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Finally, she sank back into her seat, her face red with humiliation. She crossed her arms and turned toward the window. Muttering under her breath, Elizabeth turned to James, her expression softening. "Sergeant Carter, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for your service. You don't deserve any of this." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The plane was quiet now, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with respect and a renewed sense of unity. James glanced out of the window, the endless blue sky stretching before him. For the first time since boarding, he felt a glimmer of peace. As the flight continued, Elizabeth returned to her seat, but her mind was racing. She knew this wasn't over. Evelyn Stanton needed to face the consequences of her actions, and Elizabeth was determined to ensure that justice would be served. James, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, his hand once again brushing against the photo in his pocket. He thought of his daughter's smile, of the life waiting for him back home. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope, not just for himself, but for a world where people like Evelyn were no longer allowed to thrive unchecked. The plane began its descent, the captain's calm voice announcing their approach to the airport. Outside, The golden hues of sunset bathed the clouds in a serene glow. A stark contrast to the tension simmering inside the cabin. Elizabeth Harrington sat back in her seat, her sharp blue eyes fixed ahead. She couldn't shake the anger that had been brewing since the first moment she witnessed Evelyn's behavior. Elizabeth had seen many forms of prejudice in her years as mayor: systemic injustices, subtle biases, and overt acts of hatred, but this was something else. Evelyn Stanton's cruelty was naked, unabashed, and without remorse. Elizabeth knew she couldn't let it slide. She had a responsibility, not just as a mayor, but as a human being, to stand against it. She pulled out her notebook and began jotting down details of the incident. Evelyn's words, her actions, the way Sergeant Carter had remained composed despite the insults and humiliation. Elizabeth wanted every fact documented. This wasn't just about calling Evelyn out. This was about setting a precedent as the plane taxied to the gate. The atmosphere inside the cabin was tense but expectant. Passengers whispered among themselves, exchanging glances at Evelyn, who sat stiffly in her seat, her face a mask of anger and embarrassment. James sat silently, his hands resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, Elizabeth stood. She turned to the flight attendant who had dealt with Evelyn earlier. "Ma'am, I'd like to request that airport security meet us at the gate." The flight attendant hesitated, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Security, ma'am?" "Yes," Elizabeth said firmly. "This woman assaulted a fellow passenger. And if you have surveillance footage of this flight, I suggest you secure it." Evelyn's head snapped up. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "This is ridiculous." Elizabeth ignored her, addressing the other passengers instead. "If anyone here witnessed what happened and is willing to speak on behalf of Sergeant Carter, I encourage you to come forward." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Several passengers nodded, their earlier silence replaced with a sense of duty. Evelyn stood abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at Elizabeth. "You have no right to do this. You're harassing me." Elizabeth didn't flinch. "No, ma'am, I'm holding you accountable." When the plane doors opened, 2 airport security officers were waiting. Elizabeth stepped forward, introducing herself. "I'm Mayor Elizabeth Harrington. There's been an incident on this flight that requires your attention." The officers listened as she recounted the events, backed by the flight attendant's testimony. Evelyn's protests grew louder, her voice shrill with indignation. "This is a witch hunt. You're all against me because I'm wealthy. I'll sue every last one of you." One of the officers turned to James. "Sir, are you okay? Do you want to press charges?" James hesitated. He had never been the type to seek revenge. But the weight of Evelyn's actions, and the encouragement of those around him, pressed on him. Before he could answer, Elizabeth stepped in. "Sergeant Carter has already endured enough," she said. "This is about sending a message that behavior like hers won't be tolerated." She assaulted him, verbally abused him, and disrupted the flight. "That's not just wrong, it's criminal." The officers nodded, their faces serious. "We'll take her in for questioning." Evelyn's face turned white. "You can't do this. I have rights. And so does he." Elizabeth replied coldly. "The difference is, he respects them." By the time Evelyn was escorted off the plane, the incident had gone viral. Several passengers had filmed her tirade and uploaded it to social media, where it quickly gained traction. Hashtags like #JusticeForJames and #HoldHate Accountable began trending within hours. The footage showed Evelyn berating James, her voice dripping with malice. It showed her grabbing his collar, her face twisted with rage. But it also showed James's calm, dignified response, and Elizabeth's powerful intervention. The public was outraged. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. Evelyn Stanton, a wealthy socialite with a reputation for snobbery, was now the face of unapologetic racism. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and James were hailed as heroes, Elizabeth for standing up to injustice, and James for his remarkable restraint at the airport. James sat alone in a quiet corner, waiting for his connecting flight. The weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had spent his entire life defending his country, only to return home and face a battle he thought he had left behind. Elizabeth approached, a cup of coffee in her hand. She offered it to him with a small smile. "Mind if I sit?" James nodded, gesturing to the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the airport buzzed around them, but it felt distant, almost unreal. You didn't have to do all that. James said finally, his voice low. Elizabeth shook her head. Yes, I did. And I'd do it again. What she did was wrong. And she needed to be held accountable. James sighed, running a hand over his face. I'm used to it. You know, people like her. I thought I'd be immune by now. But, it still gets to you. Elizabeth leaned forward, her expression earnest. You shouldn't have to be used to it. No one should. That's why it's so important to stand up, to show people like her that they can't get away with it. James looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not just as a soldier, but as a human being. The following day, Evelyn Stanton's world began to unravel. News outlets plastered her face across television screens and websites, dissecting her actions on the flight. Activists called for her to be charged with assault and discrimination. Former employees came forward, sharing their own stories of her abusive behavior. Evelyn's public apology, clearly written by a PR team, did little to quell the outrage. I deeply regret the events that transpired, she said in a shaky video, her eyes darting nervously. My actions were misunderstood. But the damage was done. Evelyn's name became synonymous with unchecked privilege and bigotry. Her business partnerships dissolved, her social circle shunned her, and she faced mounting legal troubles. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth worked tirelessly to turn the incident into something meaningful. She launched an initiative to combat discrimination, focusing on raising awareness and supporting victims of racial abuse. James became the face of the campaign, his story inspiring thousands. Together, they spoke at schools, community centers, and veteran organizations, sharing their message that silence in the face of hatred is complicity, and that everyone has the power to stand up for what's right. James found healing in the work. For the first time since returning from deployment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His scars, both physical and emotional, began to fade as he poured himself into the cause for James. The aftermath of the incident was a mix of relief, gratitude, and lingering frustration. As he boarded his connecting flight to finally return home, he found himself replaying Evelyn's words in his mind. Despite Elizabeth's intervention and the overwhelming support from the other passengers, the sting of the confrontation lingered. Seated by the window, James pulled out the photograph of his wife and daughter. Their smiling faces anchored him, pulling him out of the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He thought of his daughter, Ava, and how she had asked him once why people were sometimes so mean. He had struggled to answer then. And now, after everything, he still didn't have the right words. A flight attendant stopped by his seat. Sergeant Carter, she said softly, some of the passengers from the last flight wanted me to give you this. She handed him a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note signed by multiple passengers, thanking him for his service and apologizing for what he had endured. One note in particular caught his eye. You are a hero, not just for your service, but for your dignity. Thank you for reminding us of what strength looks like. Tears pricked James's eyes. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket next to the photograph. Maybe the world wasn't as hopeless as it sometimes seemed. Back in her office the next morning, Elizabeth Harrington found herself at the center of a media frenzy. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, emails from constituents, and messages from activists commending her actions on the flight. The video of her confrontation with Evelyn had gone viral, and Elizabeth's name was now trending nationwide. Her chief of staff, Claire, burst into the office holding a tablet. Elizabeth, you need to see this. Claire played a clip from a morning news show where a panel of commentators discussed the incident. Mayor Harrington's actions represent a much-needed stand against everyday racism. One commentator said, but will it lead to lasting change? Or is this just another viral moment? Elizabeth set the tablet down with a sigh. This isn't about me, she said firmly. This is about James, and everyone like him who faces this kind of treatment daily. We need to make sure this moment counts. Claire nodded. We've already received dozens of requests for interviews. People want to know what's next. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The incident had exposed an ugly truth about society. But it also presented an opportunity, a chance to spark real, tangible change. Meanwhile, James finally arrived home. As he walked through the terminal, he spotted his wife, Lisa, and daughter, Ava, waiting for him. Ava broke into a run, her small arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "Daddy," she cried, her voice filled with pure joy. James scooped her up, burying his face in her curls. For a moment, the weight of the past few days melted away, replaced by the warmth of his family. Lisa hugged him tightly, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're home," she whispered. As they drove home, James debated whether to tell Lisa about the incident on the plane. He didn't want to darken the joy of their reunion, but he also knew he couldn't keep it bottled up. Over dinner, he finally shared what had happened. Lisa listened intently, her expression shifting from shock to anger to sadness. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, her voice trembling. "You deserve better. You've always deserved better." Ava, too young to fully understand, asked innocently, "Why was the lady mean to you?" "Daddy?" James hesitated, searching for the right words. "Sometimes, people don't see others for who they really are. They let fear and hate cloud their hearts." Ava frowned. "But you're the bravest person I know." James smiled, his heart swelling with love for his daughter. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you'll ever know." While James found solace in his family, Evelyn Stanton's life was spiraling out of control. News outlets dissected every aspect of her behavior, from her public meltdown on the plane to her history of entitled, abusive conduct. Former employees and acquaintances came forward, painting a picture of a woman consumed by arrogance and prejudice. Evelyn's PR team scrambled to contain the damage, issuing carefully worded statements and arranging an exclusive interview to repair her image. But the public wasn't buying it. Social media was flooded with calls for accountability, with hashtags like #NoExcusesForHate trending worldwide. In private, Evelyn seethed. She couldn't understand why the world was against her. "I was the victim," she ranted to her lawyer. "That man made me uncomfortable. And I had every right to say so." Her lawyer sighed, clearly exhausted. "Evelyn, you need to stop talking. Every word you say makes this worse." But Evelyn wasn't interested in self-reflection. She was determined to fight back. Convinced she could reclaim her reputation through sheer willpower, the video of Evelyn's tirade sparked widespread conversations about racism and privilege. News segments featured experts discussing the deeper implications of the incident, while activists used the momentum to highlight systemic issues faced by marginalized communities. Elizabeth, meanwhile, launched an initiative called Stand Together, aimed at combating discrimination through education, community engagement, and policy reform. She invited James to join as a spokesperson, recognizing the power of his story to inspire change. At first, James was hesitant. "I'm not a politician or an activist," he told Elizabeth during a phone call. "I'm just a guy trying to get home to his family." "You're more than that," Elizabeth replied. "You're a symbol of dignity and strength. People need to hear your voice." After much thought, James agreed. His first public appearance was at a town hall organized by Elizabeth's team. Standing before a packed crowd, he shared his story, not just the incident on the plane, but his experiences as a black man in America and the challenges he had faced throughout his life. By the end of his speech, the audience was on its feet, applauding and cheering. For the first time since the plane ride, James felt a sense of empowerment. He wasn't just a victim, he was a voice for change as public pressure mounted. Local authorities opened an investigation into Evelyn's actions on the plane. The footage provided clear evidence of her verbal and physical assault, and charges were filed. Evelyn was forced to appear in court, where James and Elizabeth both testified against her. The trial became a media spectacle, with reporters capturing every moment. Evelyn's defense team tried to paint her as a misunderstood woman under stress. But the evidence and the public outcry was overwhelming. The judge delivered a scathing verdict. Evelyn was sentenced to community service in underserved communities, mandatory sensitivity training, and a public apology to James. The ruling sent a powerful message: no one, no matter how wealthy or privileged, was above accountability. In the months that followed, James and Elizabeth continued their work with Stand Together, turning the painful incident into a catalyst for progress. Schools implemented anti-discrimination programs, cities passed stronger hate crime laws, and communities came together to address prejudice head-on. James's story inspired countless others to speak out against injustice, proving that even in the face of hatred, courage and dignity could prevail. The morning after the incident, James woke to a storm he hadn't anticipated. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, texts from old friends, voicemails from people he hadn't spoken to in years, and endless pings from social media platforms. Lisa handed him her phone, her expression a mix of awe and concern. "You're everywhere," she said softly. James scrolled through post after post, each one retelling the story of what had happened on the flight. The video of Evelyn's tirade had amassed millions of views overnight, with comments flooding in from every corner of the internet. Messages of support poured in for James, hailing him as a symbol of dignity and resilience. But not all the attention was positive. Some comments dismissed the incident, accusing James of playing the victim. Others questioned why the mayor had gotten involved, claiming she had overstepped her bounds. The polarized reactions left James feeling conflicted. "I didn't ask for any of this," he murmured, setting the phone down. "I just wanted to go home." Lisa placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know, but maybe this is bigger than you now. Maybe this is your chance to make a difference." While James grappled with his newfound visibility, Evelyn found herself trapped in a very different kind of spotlight. Her name was now synonymous with hate, and her once charmed life was unraveling at an alarming speed. Invitations to exclusive social events were rescinded. Business deals she had been brokering were abruptly cancelled. Even her closest friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the fallout. Evelyn paced the confines of her penthouse, her pristine living room now cluttered with half-empty wine glasses and discarded newspapers. Headlines screamed her name. Socialites' racist rant sparks outrage. Privilege on display. Evelyn Stanton faces backlash. Her phone rang incessantly, but she ignored it, knowing it would be yet another call from her PR team, begging her to make a genuine apology. Evelyn scoffed, pouring herself another drink. Apologize? To him? Never. But deep down, cracks were beginning to form in her armor. The public backlash was relentless. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt powerless. Her wealth, her connections, her privilege, they had always been her shield. Now, they were useless. At City Hall, Elizabeth Harrington and her team were busy turning the momentum into action. Her office had become a hub of activity, with phones ringing off the hook and staff members working around the clock. The mayor's bold stance on the plane had not only garnered widespread praise but had also ignited a demand for systemic change. Claire, Elizabeth's chief of staff, entered the room with a folder in hand. "We've received over 10,000 emails in the last 24 hours. She reported. "Most are messages of support, but a significant number are asking what you plan to do next." Elizabeth nodded, her expression determined. "This can't just be a viral moment. It has to lead to something concrete." She opened the folder Claire handed her, which outlined proposals for the Stand Together initiative. The plan included mandatory anti-discrimination training for public employees, a hotline for reporting racial abuse, partnerships with schools to introduce programs teaching empathy and inclusivity. Elizabeth tapped her pen against the desk. "This is a good start," she said, "but it's not enough. I want real accountability, not just for individuals like Evelyn Stanton, but for the systems that enable this behavior." Elizabeth reached out to James, asking him to meet with her at City Hall. Initially hesitant, James agreed, realizing that the mayor's intentions were genuine. When he arrived, Elizabeth greeted him warmly and led him to a private office. "Sergeant Carter," she began, "I want to thank you again for your service, but also for your strength. What happened on that flight was unacceptable, and I'm committed to making sure it leads to real change." James shifted in his seat. "I appreciate that, Mayor Harrington, but I'm not sure what I can do. I'm not an activist. You don't have to be." Elizabeth replied, "Your story has already inspired so many. I want to give you the platform to share it, to show people that dignity and resilience can overcome hate." James frowned, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I didn't handle it perfectly. There were moments I wanted to fight back, to shout at her, but I didn't because I've seen enough conflict. I didn't want to be the cause of more." Elizabeth leaned forward, her gaze steady. "That restraint is exactly why your voice matters. People need to see that it's possible to rise above, even when you're being dragged down." After a long pause, James nodded. "I'll do it, but only if we focus on solutions, not just the problem." "Agreed," Elizabeth said with a smile as the public uproar continued. Legal action against Evelyn moved forward. The footage from the flight, combined with multiple witness statements, left her little room for defense. Evelyn's lawyers advised her to settle, But she refused, convinced she could talk her way out of the situation. In court, however, Evelyn's arrogance worked against her. When asked if she regretted her actions, she gave a dismissive response. Regret? For what? Speaking my mind? I was uncomfortable, and I voiced it. Isn't that my right? The judge's expression hardened. Your right ends where another person's begins. Ms. Stanton, your behavior was not only reprehensible but criminal. This court will not tolerate such actions. Evelyn was sentenced to 300 hours of community service in underserved communities, a hefty fine, and mandatory participation in anti-discrimination workshops. The ruling made national headlines, with many hailing it as a step toward accountability. Meanwhile, James began his journey as an advocate for change. With Elizabeth's support, he spoke at town halls, schools, and community events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand against hate. His humility and authenticity resonated deeply, drawing crowds wherever he went. At one event, a young boy approached James, his eyes wide with admiration. You're a real hero, the boy said, not because you're a soldier, but because you stood up to someone mean. James knelt to the boy's level, smiling. Thank you, but the real heroes are people like you, people who treat others with kindness. No matter what, the boy beamed, and James felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. His story was no longer just his, it belonged to everyone fighting for a better, more just world. The impact of the incident rippled far beyond the flight. Schools implemented new programs to address prejudice. Companies adopted stricter anti-discrimination policies. Even national leaders took notice, citing the incident as a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Elizabeth and James continued their collaboration, their shared mission growing into a movement that inspired hope and action. Together, they proved that even in the face of hatred, justice and compassion could prevail. Evelyn Stanton's community service began on a cold, overcast morning. She arrived at a local outreach center in the heart of a neighborhood she had never set foot in. Gone were her designer clothes and arrogant demeanor. Clad in a plain t-shirt and jeans provided by the center, Evelyn stood out as a reluctant outsider. Her court-mandated supervisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla, greeted her with a clipboard and a no-nonsense attitude. Welcome to your first day, Ms. Stanton, Carla said, her tone brisk. Today, you'll be serving meals in the soup kitchen. Gloves and apron are over there. Let's keep this moving. Evelyn's lip curled in disdain as she stared at the worn apron. Do I really have to? Yes, Carla interrupted, her expression unyielding. This isn't a negotiation, it's a consequence. Evelyn bit back a retort, her face flushing with indignation. As she stepped behind the counter, she caught the eyes of the people she was serving, parents struggling to feed their children, elderly individuals clutching trays with shaking hands, and young people who looked far too old for their years. For the first time, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Shame, perhaps, or fear. While Evelyn grappled with her new reality, James Carter was embracing his role as a voice for justice. His work with Elizabeth Harrington's Stand Together initiative was gaining traction nationwide. Town halls were packed with people eager to hear him speak, and schools across the country were implementing programs inspired by his story. One evening, after a particularly moving event, James found himself approached by a young woman named Maria. She introduced herself as the daughter of a veteran who had faced similar discrimination. My dad never talked about it, Maria said, her voice trembling, but I know he went through so much. Seeing you stand up for yourself, it makes me feel like I'm standing up for him, too. James was deeply moved. Your dad's sacrifices matter, he said, and so does your voice. Keep standing up, for him and for yourself. As Maria walked away, James realized how far his journey had taken him. He was no longer just a soldier returning home. He had become a beacon of hope for others, a role he never expected but was determined to honor. Weeks into her community service, Evelyn's arrogance began to crack. Each day at the outreach center brought new challenges, stripping away the layers of entitlement she had spent a lifetime cultivating. She cleaned floors, sorted donations, and served meals to people she once would have ignored on the street. One afternoon, a young boy approached her with a hesitant smile. His clothes were patched and worn, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. Are you the lady from the video? He asked, clutching a small toy truck. Evelyn froze. Yes, I am. The boy nodded thoughtfully. My mom said you were mean. But you're nice now, right? The simplicity of his question hit her like a blow. For the first time, Evelyn felt the full weight of her actions. She had been mean, not just to James, but to everyone she had ever looked down on. The boy's innocence pierced through her defenses, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. I'm trying, she said quietly, her voice breaking. I'm trying to be better. Months after the incident, Elizabeth Harrington organized a community forum to celebrate the progress made through the Stand Together initiative. The event was held in a large auditorium, with attendees ranging from local leaders to everyday citizens. James was the keynote speaker, his presence a symbol of resilience and hope. As he took the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. James stood for a moment, taking it all in. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain, the anger, and the eventual healing. Thank you, he began, his voice steady. When I boarded that plane, I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to go home. But life has a way of putting us in situations we didn't ask for. What matters is how we respond. He spoke about his experiences as a soldier, a father, and a black man in America. He talked about the importance of standing up to hate, not with anger, but with courage and dignity. By the time he finished, the audience was on its feet, many wiping tears from their eyes. As James stepped off the stage, Elizabeth approached him. You've done something incredible, she said, and this is just the beginning. Unbeknownst to James, Evelyn Stanton had also been invited to the forum. Elizabeth had arranged for her to make a public apology, a final step in her path toward accountability. The room grew quiet as Evelyn took the stage, her usual confidence replaced with a tentative humility. I'm not proud of the person I was, Evelyn began, her voice trembling. That day on the plane, I let my fear and prejudice control me. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and I betrayed the values I claimed to stand for. She turned to James, who watched her with a guarded expression. Sergeant Carter, I can't undo the pain I caused you, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. James stood, meeting her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he nodded, a small but powerful gesture of acknowledgement in the months and years that followed. The incident became a turning point for both James and Evelyn. James continued his work with the Stand Together initiative, using his platform to advocate for equality and justice. His story inspired a wave of grassroots movements, each one building on the foundation he had helped create. Evelyn, meanwhile, dedicated herself to understanding the harm she had caused. She completed her community service with a renewed sense of purpose, eventually volunteering at the outreach center long after her sentence had ended. While she knew she could never erase her past, she was determined to build a better future. Elizabeth Harrington, the driving force behind the movement, was re-elected in a landslide victory, her leadership celebrated as a beacon of hope in turbulent times. Years later, James found himself on a stage once more, this time receiving an award for his contributions to social justice. As he accepted the honor, he glanced at the audience and spotted Elizabeth and Evelyn sitting side by side. The sight filled him with a sense of closure. In his acceptance speech, James said, "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey, one step at a time. But together, we can create a world where dignity and respect aren't privileges, they're rights." As the crowd erupted into applause, James felt a profound sense of peace. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something greater, a legacy of hope and resilience that would endure for generations. For Evelyn Stanton, the weeks following her public apology were grueling. She became the target of harsh criticism, even after she acknowledged her wrongdoings. Social media posts accused her of insincerity, while tabloids tore into her privileged past. Friends she once considered close avoided her calls, unwilling to be associated with her tarnished reputation. Despite everything, Evelyn persisted. She continued volunteering at the outreach center, slowly building relationships with the people she had once dismissed as beneath her. The work was humbling, sorting through donated clothes, cleaning bathrooms, and serving meals day after day, but it began to shift something within her. For the first time, she was seeing people not as stereotypes but as individuals with complex stories and struggles. One morning, as Evelyn was cleaning tables, an elderly man named Mr. Jacobs struck up a conversation. "You're the lady from the news, aren't you?" he asked. his voice tinged with curiosity. Evelyn froze. Yes, she admitted, bracing for the inevitable lecture. But Mr. Jacobs surprised her. People make mistakes, he said. What matters is what you do after. Are you here for the right reasons? Or just to save face? The question lingered with Evelyn long after their conversation ended. She realized that redemption wasn't about proving herself to others, it was about truly changing who she was. Meanwhile, the Stand Together initiative was rapidly growing. Elizabeth Harrington's leadership had turned it into a national movement, with chapters sprouting up in cities across the country. Schools adopted anti-bias curriculums, while corporations began implementing more rigorous diversity training programs. James Carter's story remained at the heart of the initiative, inspiring countless individuals to stand up against hate. He spent his days traveling to different communities, sharing his experiences and encouraging dialogue about racism, privilege, and empathy. At one event, James was approached by a high school teacher who shared how his story had changed her classroom. "Your story helped my students open up about their own experiences with discrimination," she said. "You've given them the courage to speak out." James nodded, deeply moved. "That's the goal," he said. "Change starts with conversations, real ones, even when they're uncomfortable." As Evelyn continued her journey toward redemption, she encountered an unexpected ally, Carla, her supervisor at the outreach center. Initially skeptical of Evelyn's intentions, Carla had kept her at arm's length, assigning her the most demanding tasks. But over time, she began to notice a genuine shift in Evelyn's attitude. One evening, as they locked up the center, Carla spoke up. "You've changed," she said, her tone softened. "When you first got here, I thought you were just another rich lady trying to avoid jail time. But now, I think you're trying to make things right." Evelyn looked down, ashamed. "I've done so much damage," she admitted. "How do I even begin to fix it?" "You don't," Carla said firmly. "You can't change the past. But you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward. That's what matters." The conversation marked a turning point for Evelyn. She began to see her community service not as a punishment but as an opportunity to rebuild, not just her reputation, but her character. The incident on the plane continued to spark national conversations about systemic racism and privilege. News networks hosted panels featuring activists, educators, and lawmakers discussing how to address these issues on a larger scale. Elizabeth Harrington appeared on several programs, using her platform to push for legislative change. "This isn't just about one person's actions on a plane," she said during one interview. "It's about a culture that allows prejudice to thrive. We need to dismantle the systems that enable discrimination, whether it's in education, the workplace, or our justice system." Her words resonated with millions, but they also drew criticism from some quarters. Conservative pundits accused her of overstepping, while others questioned whether initiatives like Stand Together could truly create lasting change. James, watching the debates unfold, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but he also knew it was worth fighting for as part of her legal sentence. Evelyn was required to attend a final hearing to evaluate her progress. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers, all eager to see how the case would unfold. James was there too, seated in the front row, though he hadn't initially planned to attend. Elizabeth had convinced him it was important to witness the outcome of their shared fight for justice. When Evelyn took the stand, the room fell silent. She spoke haltingly, her voice raw with emotion. "This experience has been the most humbling of my life," she said. "I've learned that privilege can blind you to the humanity of others. I failed to see Sergeant Carter for who he really is, a man of integrity and courage. For that, I am deeply sorry." The judge considered her words carefully before delivering the verdict. While Evelyn's progress was acknowledged, the judge emphasized that her journey was far from over. "Accountability doesn't end in this courtroom," he said. "It's a lifelong commitment to being better." After the hearing, James found himself approached by Evelyn. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she began, "but I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be the kind of person who wouldn't have treated you the way I did." James studied her for a moment. "It's not about me forgiving you," he said. "It's about you forgiving yourself, and proving that you change." Evelyn nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered before walking away. In the years that followed, The impact of the Stand Together initiative continued to grow. Schools reported decreases in bullying and racial incidents. Workplaces saw improvements in inclusivity. And communities came together to address long-standing divisions. James became a prominent figure in the movement. His story a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Though he often downplayed his role, those who heard him speak were deeply inspired by his humility and strength. Elizabeth Harrington's leadership cemented her legacy as a champion for justice. Her collaboration with James became a model for how public figures and everyday citizens could work together to create meaningful change. Years later, James stood at a memorial dedicated to the Stand Together initiative. His daughter Ava, now a young woman, by his side. The inscription read, "In honor of those who rise above hate to build a world of compassion and equality." "Do you ever think about that day on the plane?" Ava asked, her voice thoughtful. "Sometimes," James admitted, "but not because of the pain. I think about it because it showed me how much good can come from standing up for what's right." As he gazed at the memorial, James felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. In the face of hate, he had chosen dignity. In the face of injustice, he had chosen courage, and in doing so, he had helped pave the way for a brighter future. James lingered at the memorial, running his fingers gently over the engraved words. The memorial itself was simple but powerful, polished stone surrounded by a garden of native flowers, symbolizing resilience and growth. Visitors came from all over the country to see it, often leaving notes and mementos at its base. Each item told a story of lives changed, communities strengthened, and people inspired. Ava stood quietly beside him, watching her father with a mixture of pride and reverence. She had grown up hearing his story, but standing here now, she felt its full weight. "You changed everything, Dad," she said softly. James smiled, his expression contemplative. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone who stood up, who spoke out, who chose to do the right thing when it mattered." Ava tilted her head. "Do you think Evelyn ever comes here?" James's gaze drifted to the horizon. He hadn't spoken to Evelyn since their brief encounter after her court hearing years ago. From time to time, he heard snippets about her efforts to rebuild her life, her continued volunteering at the outreach center, her advocacy for racial equity, her quiet but determined push for personal growth. "Maybe," James said after a moment. "And if she does, I hope it reminds her of what's possible when we face the truth about ourselves." Unbeknownst to James, Evelyn Stanton had indeed visited the memorial many times, though she always came early in the morning to avoid being seen. For her, it was a place of reflection, a reminder of the person she had been and the person she was striving to become. She often left small bouquets of wildflowers at the base, a quiet gesture of atonement. On this particular morning, Evelyn approached the memorial with a mixture of apprehension and hope. She noticed James and Ava standing there and hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt. But something inside her urged her forward. James turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. Ava glanced between them, sensing the history that hung heavily in the air. "Sergeant Carter," Evelyn began, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't expect to see you here." James regarded her for a long moment before nodding. "Evelyn, I wanted to thank you," she continued, "not just for your grace that day, but for everything you've done since. You turned what I did, what I said, into something meaningful. I'll never be able to fully repay that." James studied her, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor, the humility in her tone, the sincerity in her eyes. He nodded again. "It's not about repayment, it's about making things better. And from what I've heard, you've been doing that." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "I'm trying." As Evelyn left, James turned back to Ava, who watched the interaction with wide eyes. "Was that her?" she asked. Her voice hushed. "Yes," James said simply. "She seemed different," Ava remarked. James nodded. "People can change if they're willing to do the work." They stood in silence for a while, the wind rustling gently through the flowers. James thought back to that day on the plane, the anger, the pain, and the overwhelming sense of isolation. But he also thought about Elizabeth Harrington's unwavering stand, the passengers who eventually found their voices, and the journey that had led him here. The story of James Carter and the incident on the plane was one of pain and transformation. It began with a moment of injustice, a soldier, tired and longing to return home, faced with the cruelty of prejudice. It escalated into a confrontation that tested not only his resolve but the courage of those around him. Elizabeth Harrington's intervention was a turning point, proving that leadership isn't about titles but about standing up when it matters most. Her actions catalyzed a movement that extended far beyond the confines of that plane, inspiring change on a national scale. Evelyn Stanton's journey was one of reckoning and redemption. Her initial arrogance and entitlement gave way to a painful but necessary self-examination. Through her community service and continued efforts, she demonstrated that while change is never easy, it is always possible. For James, the experience reaffirmed his belief in the power of resilience and dignity. What began as an act of endurance became a platform for advocacy, transforming him into a symbol of hope for countless others. The Stand Together initiative became a testament to the idea that even in the face of hate, individuals have the power to create ripples of change. Its legacy was not just in the policies it inspired but in the countless lives it touched. As James and Ava walked away from the memorial, he felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led to something greater, a legacy of compassion, justice, and unity. The story reminds us that justice is not just about holding people accountable but about creating opportunities for growth and healing. It challenges us to confront prejudice with courage, to respond to hate with dignity, and to believe in the potential for transformation. In the end, it is through these choices that we build a better, more compassionate world.